Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. So, you wanted to really understand the Supreme Court's decision on the TikTok ban, huh?
Yeah, it's been a hot topic for a while now, for sure.
Yeah, so that's our deep dive today. What's the story behind all this? Why does it even matter? And what are the key takeaways?
Right.
We've got a lot to get through today, guys. Opinions straight from the court itself, a concurring opinion from Justice Sotomayor,
Wow.
and another one from Justice Gorsuch.
Oh, wow. This is going to be good.
A lot to unpack.
Yeah.
All right, so to get us all on the same page, let's talk about TikTok itself. I mean, it's insanely popular, over 170 million users just in the US. What is it about those short videos that's just so captivating?
Well, I think a big part of it is the For You page algorithm.
Right.
It's like having a personal entertainment DJ just constantly learning what you like and serving up those videos tailored just for you.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It's like a personalized, endlessly scrolling feed that, keeps users hooked.
Absolutely, yeah. Keeps you scrolling, for sure.
Hmm.
So it's not just about the catchy videos themselves, it's about the way they're chosen and presented to you, right?
Absolutely.
But there's also content moderation happening behind the scenes. Automated, human, the whole works, right?
Right. Think of it like a filter, kind of on top of that algorithm.
Mm.
So TikTok is actively shaping what users see,
Wow.
removing content that violates their community guidelines. And they even, sometimes they'll promote or demote content to try to achieve, specific goals.
Huh. Interesting. Okay, so we've got this super popular platform, powerful algorithm, a lot of behind-the-scenes content shaping going on. But here's where it gets really interesting. Why is the government so concerned about TikTok?
Well, it all boils down to data security.
Okay.
TikTok's parent company, ByteDance Ltd., is based in China. And under Chinese law, companies are required to share data with the government if they ask for it.
See, and that's what raises those red flags for U.S. officials, because we're talking about a lot of personal data here. I mean, everything from age, location, to even potentially like the content of private messages.
Exactly. All that stuff is up for grabs.
Oh, wow.
The worry is that this data could be used for, well, anything really. Tracking individuals, corporate espionage, you name it. And with millions of Americans on TikTok, the amount of potential data, I mean, it's a huge concern for the government.
Makes sense. And this isn't a new concern either.
Right.
I mean, it's been simmering for a while. Executive orders from President Trump, negotiations with the Biden administration, and then finally, Congress steps in with the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act.
Yeah, we'll just call it the Act for simplicity's sake.
Yeah, that's much easier.
Much easier. And it's this act that brings us to the Supreme Court.
Okay, so the case goes to the Supreme Court. What were the main arguments being thrown around?
Well, on TikTok's side, they argued that the act was basically a ban in disguise, a violation of their First Amendment rights. They said it restricted freedom of expression and association by essentially, shutting down the platform in the U.S.
So they're saying, hey, our platform allows for all sorts of creative expression and personal connections, and this act is way too broad in its restrictions.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Exactly.
Okay.
They were also arguing that the act wasn't subject to strict scrutiny, which is, the highest level of judicial review.
Okay, hold on. What is strict scrutiny, and why wouldn't the act be subject to it?
Good question. Strict scrutiny is a legal test that courts use to determine if a law is constitutional. Think of it as a really high bar the government has to clear to prove that a law is actually necessary and doesn't stomp on fundamental rights more than it absolutely has to. So for a law to pass this strict scrutiny test, it has to be serving a compelling government interest and be narrowly tailored to actually achieve that interest.
Okay, so TikTok was basically saying, look, this act isn't narrowly tailored enough.
Right. And they also claimed it wasn't content neutral,
Okay.
meaning it's targeting specific types of speech based on, what's being said.
Interesting.
Content-based restrictions are generally subject to strict scrutiny because they're seen as, well, more likely to kind of chill free speech.
I see. Okay, so that's TikTok's side. But what did the government argue back? Did the court even buy into this argument about the act not being content neutral?
Well, the government pushed back hard, arguing that the act was content neutral. You see, it's not about, controlling the messages or viewpoints on TikTok specifically.
Okay.
It's about who controls the platform and the potential for misuse of that data, regardless of what's being shared.
So they're saying it's not about what people are posting, but about the fact that the Chinese government could get a hold of all that user data.
Exactly. And the court ultimately agreed with the government on this point, saying The act is content neutral because it's motivated by concern about China potentially getting its hands on all this data from millions of Americans, not by, like, a desire to suppress specific types of speech.
Okay, so they're basically saying, we get it, national security is a big deal.
Yeah.
We're willing to give you some leeway here. So they're not really concerned with what people are saying on TikTok. They're concerned with who might be listening in.
Pretty much, yeah. And this whole content neutrality issue, this was crucial because it determined what level of scrutiny would be applied to the act.
Okay.
Since they decided it was content neutral, they didn't apply strict scrutiny. They went with intermediate scrutiny.
Okay, hold on. I'm getting a little lost in the legal jargon here.
Yeah, sorry about that.
What exactly is intermediate scrutiny, and how's it different from strict scrutiny?
Right, so intermediate scrutiny is another legal test, but it's less demanding than strict scrutiny.
Oh, okay.
For a law to pass intermediate scrutiny, it needs to serve an important government interest, not a compelling one,
Okay.
and be substantially related to achieving that interest.
Got it. So the bar's a little lower here.
A little bit, yeah. Basically, the government have a little more wiggle room to restrict speech or conduct when it's not going directly after the content of that speech.
Okay, so the court decided that because this act was more about data security and not about what people are actually posting on TikTok,
Yeah.
it didn't have to meet that super high bar of strict scrutiny.
Right.
It just needed to meet this intermediate scrutiny standard.
Right.
But did it?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting.
Oh, man. I can't wait to hear this. But we're going to have to pause here and pick up the rest of this discussion in part 2 of this deep dive.
Oh, man.
Stay tuned.
I'm on the edge of my seat. So we left off talking about how the court decided to use intermediate scrutiny on the act.
Right, because they saw it as content neutral. Not about what's being said on TikTok, but about who could get access to all that user data.
Exactly. And to pass that intermediate scrutiny test, the government had to prove that the act serves an important government interest and that it's substantially related to actually achieving that interest. And the court found that it did.
So walk me through it. What was the court's reasoning here? Why did they think the act passed that test?
Well, the court acknowledged the government's argument that, protecting sensitive data, especially from a foreign adversary, is a pretty important interest.
Right.
National security is a big deal. They were willing to give Congress and the president a fair amount of leeway in how to address those risks.
So even though there wasn't, concrete proof that China had already misused TikTok user data, the potential for misuse was enough to justify the act in the court's eyes.
Yeah, it seems like it. Like that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Right.
They were more worried about preventing potential harm than waiting for, absolute proof that harm had already happened.
But that brings up some interesting questions, though. Where do we draw the line? How much potential harm is enough to justify restricting freedoms? Especially when we're talking about something as fundamental as free speech.
That's the million-dollar question, and this case really highlights the tension between, preventative measures and waiting for concrete evidence of wrongdoing, and how we balance those things in this, rapidly changing digital world.
It's like we're always playing catch-up, trying to apply old rules to these new technologies, situations that we couldn't even imagine a few years ago.
Exactly. And the court is grappling with those challenges, too.
It seems like it, for sure.
Their decision really reflects this struggle to balance national security and individual rights in this new digital landscape.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about those concurring opinions from Justices Sotomayor and Gorsuch.
Yeah, they both agreed with the overall judgment, but offered some, additional perspectives. Justice Sotomayor, while agreeing that the act passes intermediate scrutiny, made it clear that she thinks it has some pretty significant First Amendment implications.
So she's like, look, I get why you decided this way, but let's not pretend this isn't a big deal for free speech.
Yeah, pretty much. She was worried that letting the government restrict access to a platform just because of who controls it, without proving that the content itself is actually harmful, could set a dangerous precedent.
It's like she's saying we need to be really careful about giving the government that power to decide what platforms we can use, what voices get silenced.
Exactly. That concern about, viewpoint discrimination and the potential for government overreach, it goes way beyond this case.
Absolutely. What about Justice Gorsuch? He seemed to have a slightly different take on the issue.
Yeah, he did. He was pretty skeptical about the content manipulation argument.
Interesting.
He wasn't convinced that the act was necessary to prevent China from, using TikTok to influence what Americans see or believe.
I'm struggling with that whole content manipulation thing, too. It feels a little slippery. I mean, couldn't any platform be accused of that?
Right.
Isn't that what algorithms do? Where's the line?
That's a great point. And it gets at this bigger debate about online content moderation,
Right.
and the role of algorithms. Gorsuch argued that the solution to bad speech or potentially harmful content is usually more speech, not government restrictions. He's generally in favor of open dialogue, a free exchange of ideas as the best way to combat, harmful stuff.
The classic marketplace of ideas argument, just let all the voices be heard and the truth will win out.
Right. But he also acknowledged that this case presents a unique challenge because of the potential for a foreign adversary to use a platform like TikTok to, manipulate information and influence public opinion.
So it's tricky, right? On one hand, you have this potential for foreign influence, data misuse, and then on the other hand, concerns about free speech and, potential government censorship.
Yeah, a real balancing act. And the courts seem to acknowledge that tension. They left the door open for future challenges, recognizing that technology is always changing. What seems like a necessary precaution today might not be so necessary tomorrow.
So they're basically saying this is our best judgment based on what we know right now, but we're open to changing course if things change.
Pretty much, yeah. They acknowledged how dynamic this issue is and that we need to keep talking about it and debating it.
Okay, but let's get back to the court's decision on the specifics of the act. They said a qualified divestiture had to completely cut off any operational relationship between TikTok's U.S. operations and ByteDance.
Right, including stuff like cooperation on the algorithm or data sharing. Pretty sweeping.
And TikTok argued that this was way too broad, unnecessary to actually achieve data security.
Exactly.
They felt there were less restrictive ways to go about it,
Right.
like data localization, where user data is stored in the U.S., or having independent audits to ensure compliance.
Right. They argued these measures could achieve the same level of protection without totally severing ties with ByteDance.
So they were looking for a more targeted approach.
Yeah, a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer.
But what did the court say about these alternatives? Did they buy it?
Not really. They acknowledged that less restrictive measures might be possible, but ultimately they deferred to Congress's judgment.
So they're like, look, Congress is the one with the expertise on national security. They decided this was the best way to go. We're not going to second guess them.
Pretty much.
So even though there might have been other options, the court was hesitant to overrule Congress on a national security matter.
Right. They seemed very aware of that separation of powers. Different branches of government have different areas of expertise.
Makes sense.
They didn't want to substitute their judgment for that of Congress, especially on such a touchy subject.
Yeah, okay, I get that. But it does raise some questions about the balance of power, and the role of the courts in keeping an eye on government actions, even in the name of national security.
Absolutely. And that's another reason why this case is so fascinating. It's bigger than just TikTok.
Right.
It gets at these fundamental questions about how we govern ourselves in the digital age, how we balance individual rights with collective security, and how we make sure the power of the government, especially when it comes to technology, is being used responsibly.
It's a lot to think about, for sure.
It is.
But you know what? This is exactly the kind of deep dive we need to be having right now. This case has so many layers.
It does.
We need to unpack them all to really understand what this decision means, not just for TikTok, but for the future of online communication, content moderation, and the whole relationship between technology and government.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of unpacking, there's one more thing about the court's decision we haven't touched on.
Yeah.
They specifically chose not to use classified evidence the government presented.
Oh, yeah. That's a big deal. Why was that so significant?
Well, it gets to the heart of due process. The idea that everyone deserves a fair hearing. To think that a case could be decided based on evidence that the opposing side can't even see? It's pretty unsettling.
Yeah, that seems like a basic fairness issue. Why
Right.
can you defend yourself against something you don't even know about?
Exactly. And in a case about free speech and national security, that kind of secrecy is even more troubling.
Absolutely.
The court refusing to even consider that classified evidence sends a strong message. Transparency and due process are important, even in sensitive cases.
Yeah. Even when we're afraid, we can't just abandon our core values. But this whole TikTok situation is a conundrum, isn't it? The risks are real, but so are the concerns about restricting a platform so many Americans use.
Absolutely. It's that classic dilemma. How do we balance security with freedom? No easy answers. The court's decision reflects that. They acknowledge both sides, but ultimately went with the government's take on the risks.
So they're saying that in this specific case, the harm to national security outweighs the potential limits on free speech.
That's how I see it. But remember, they didn't completely shut down future challenges. Congress can revisit the issue if less drastic solutions come up.
It's like they're saying, this is what we think now, but we're open to adjusting as things develop, which is good because this issue is going to be around for a while.
Oh yeah, for sure. And
That's
that's why it's so important to keep talking about it, keep digging deeper, examining every angle.
That's what we do here. Break down these complex issues, explore different views, help you make sense of it all. But we've covered a lot of ground. Time for a quick break. We'll be back to finish our deep dive on the TikTok ban and what it all means. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into this whole TikTok ban situation.
I know, right?
Lots to digest. So beyond all the legal back and forth, what are the big takeaways here? How does this decision reflect those, broader challenges we're facing in a world where technology is changing everything?
Yeah, it really highlights the tension between, individual rights and national security, and how we define and protect things like free speech in this digital world, especially how we make sure the government's power when it comes to tech is used responsibly.
It's a reminder that those old rules and principles, they might not work for today's problems.
Exactly.
We need to be involved in this conversation, asking tough questions, demanding evidence, holding our leaders accountable for making decisions that work and also respect our freedoms.
Right, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah,
Shed light on these complex issues, break them down, and spark some conversations.
exactly. At the end of the day, these aren't just like abstract legal debates. They affect all of us.
They do, big time.
The decisions we make about how we govern technology will shape the digital world of the future.
Absolutely. And those decisions impact everything. Our privacy, our freedom to speak our minds, even the very nature of our democracy. It's a lot.
So, where do we go from here? What are the key things to remember? What should we be thinking about as we process all of this?
Well, for me, it underscores the need for a more informed discussion about how technology, national security, and individual rights all intersect. We got to move beyond the sound bites and slogans and really dig into these complex issues.
I totally agree. We can't just blindly accept what the government says, even if it's in the name of security. We need to ask those critical questions, demand evidence, and hold our leaders accountable for their choices.
Couldn't agree more. And we have to think about the unintended consequences. Every action online has ripple effects. We got to be mindful of how those might impact us and future generations.
This TikTok ban is just the tip of the iceberg, right?
All right.
It's about so much more. The future of how we communicate online, how the government can regulate content, and that constant balancing act between security and freedom.
It's a wake-up call, really. The choices we make today will affect the digital world tomorrow.
That's for sure.
It's up to all of us to stay informed, get involved, and speak up about how we want that future to look.
Absolutely. Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into this complex issue. And to our listeners, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going. We'll see you next time.